So our first session of the day is Displays of Power with Catherine Nuckols-Wilde. So it's a nice little infographic for you. We have Catherine ready and waiting to go. So I am going to find her introduction. Sorry. I dislike screen sharing. I always lose everything that I'm doing. So Catherine is a PhD student in art history and Latin American studies at Tulane University. As an epigrapher and art historian, she investigates the ancient art and writing of the ancient Maya. She is particularly interested in the ways in which the Maya conceived of these two categories as extensions of each other. In her dissertation, she examines Maya full-figure glyphs as a clear intersection of the visual and the textual. In addition to her academic work, Catherine is also the founder of the Mesoamerican Studies Online, a blog and podcast that aims to share current scholarship on ancient Mesoamerica with the general public. The title of her paper is The Spoils of War and the Privileges of Rulers, Maya Full-Figure Glyphs as Signs of Privilege and Dominion. And before I hand over to Catherine, if you are feeling the need to use hashtags at any point of today, we do have a lot of them. They are all in the program for the conference. This particular hashtag for Catherine's session is OAW session, Displays of Power. So Catherine, thank you for your patience. Please take it away.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And we are set to go. All right. So thank you so much, first of all, to SASA for putting together this conference and giving me the opportunity to present. I'm really excited about it. I'm also currently in Mexico working on an extension of this research. My internet should be good, but I'm apologizing in advance in case it's not. It's not my usual internet. But so I wanted to go ahead and just get started with this presentation. I have made a slight change to the title, The Spoils of War or the Privileges of Rulers, which will come into play throughout the presentation. In the 8th century CE, in the 8th century CE, Maya scribes at the sites of Quiriguá and Copan, among others, began carving unique inscriptions using glyphs formed from the bodies of full-figured deities. These inscriptions use standard Maya hieroglyphs, but build on their iconic properties to create a moment in which the glyphs appear to be living creatures, grappling with each other, straining to free themselves from the glyph block containing them, and in some cases, sitting quietly and affably with each other in the civil attitude of rulers. My dissertation examines these inscriptions as both visual and linguistic objects, analyzing their iconographic content, their role in visual programs at Maya sites, and the way that they represent an ongoing interaction between the textual and the visual in the Maya world. For today's presentation, I focus on one specific question. In moments of conflict and competition, as is the case in Quiriguá's rebellion against Copan, what role did full-figure inscriptions play, if any? I argue that rather than spoils of war, full-figure glyphs function as an index of a ruler's ability to wield power and commission accomplished artists. But first, I want to provide some important context. The Maya culture began and continues to thrive in Guatemala, southeastern Mexico and its Yucatan Peninsula, Belize, and the western parts of Honduras and El Salvador, essentially the right side of the screen shown here. The heart of the ancient Maya world, particularly the classic period that I study, resided in the lowland regions of Guatemala's Petén and extended into the peripheral areas surrounding it. On the eastern side of the region, just across the modern Guatemala-Honduras border, the site of Copan became an important cultural center, despite being on the very edge of the Maya world. Its innovation in art and architecture make it stand out as one of the most famous of Maya cities. Just to the northeast, in modern-day Guatemala, the much smaller site of Quiriguá sits near the Motagua River Valley, the most famous source of jade in all of Mesoamerica. This small site, originally established by nearby Copan, now boasts the largest stele in the Maya world. The Maya occupied this area from time immemorial and continue to occupy the area today, surviving even the worst of colonialism. Those of us who study the ancient Maya generally divide our study into 3 periods: the pre-classic, the classic, and the post-classic, ending in 1521 with the European invasion of Mesoamerican shores. Today's presentation centers on a small sliver of time towards the end of the classic period, the 8th century CE, as the Maya civilization reached a peak of social and cultural development. The function and implications of full figure glyphs at Copan and Quiriguá rely heavily on an understanding of the site's history and interactions with each other. So I'm going to give you a brief introduction. I mentioned previously that Copan founded Quiriguá. It did so in the early classic period after the reign of its most famous founder, Quiriguá, who Copan continued to revere for generations after his death. Copan's own founding stems from Quiriguá's famous journey to the central Mexican site of Teotihuacan, where he participated in a ritual that granted him authority to act as a founding dynast and establish his own dynasty. Through the generations of after Quiriguá's founding by Copan, rulers of the smaller site would dedicate monuments that cited their connection to Copan. These connections largely reference a blood connection between the rulers of the two sites, suggesting that the site of Quiriguá might have been ruled either by younger brothers or half-brothers of the heirs of the Copan dynasty. Relations between the two sites are recorded matter-of-factly for the most part during the reigns of Copan's first 12 rulers, and not much changed until the reign of Huaxatlahun Ubaj-Kawil, Copan's 13th ruler. This ruler reigned for more than 40 years and transformed much of the site. He dedicated a series of stelae in the site's main plaza, each representing him in moments of powerful ritual. In 724, he supervised the accession of the new ruler at Quiriguá, Cactiliu Chanyapat, a ruler who would prove to become Huaxatlahun Ubaj-Kawil's political undoing. After 14 years subordinate to Copan, Quiriguá's ruler, Cactiliu, appears to have decided that he preferred independence for his site. Although the exact machinations of the event are unclear, what is clear is that in 738 CE, Cactiliu Chanyapat orchestrated a rebellion with the help of a larger, powerful site to the north called Calakmul. In this rebellion, Copan's ruler, Huaxatlahun Ubaj-Kawil, was taken captive and later beheaded at the hands of his subordinate and likely relative. This event would provoke a level of animosity between the two sites that lasted for the better part of the century, until the death of Quiriguá's liberator in 785. Cactiliu Chanyapat's first act as an independent ruler are very revealing. Although no monuments are dedicated for about 7 years after the battle, Cactiliu sets to work on a program of consolidation, opening a sandstone quarry from which he could harvest materials for his own monuments. His first stela, Stela S, was dedicated in 746 CE, followed by Stela H in later years, pictured here. This represents the first time in recent Quiriguá history that a ruler had commissioned a portrait of himself in monumental architecture. Matthew Looper, who wrote a book on the reign of Cactiliu Chanyapat, argued that perhaps while he was subordinate to Copan, Cactiliu was not allowed to commission likenesses of himself, and this would be the first sign of his independence, that he commissioned one. I agree with this conclusion, especially because this idea of figuration and portraiture were really important aspects of elite monumental art. Another unique aspect of Cactiliu's monumental art program, following the defeat of Copan, is that in the years following his victory, the monuments erected at the site seem clearly intended to improve on or copy those dedicated in recent history at Copan, including Stela H's attempt at copying Copan's Stela J. And I'll kind of flip back and forth between these two so you can compare the monuments and the quality. David Stewart, Elizabeth Newsom, and Matthew Looper have all written about this phenomenon, in which Cactiliu appears to imitate the programs that became such a distinguishing factor at Copan. But in the opinion of many, they never rise to the same quality that was seen at Copan. Full figure inscriptions also appeared during the reign of Cactiliu Chanyapat, as I mentioned before, and this was the first time that glyphs of this type were used at the site. Other scholars have drawn attention to the fact that they only appear after Quiriguá attains independence, and this led to my original question: were full figure glyphs, or perhaps the scribes who carved them, a spoil of war taken by Quiriguá after its defeat of Copan? Perhaps the most popular theory for the origin of full figure glyphs at Quiriguá offers the possibility that during or immediately after the battle with Copan, Cactiliu Chanyapat took the Copan scribes captive as part of the bounty accorded to him as the winning ruler. This theory is bolstered by evidence from other parts of the Maya world, including the murals seen here from Bonampak, in which we see scribes taken captive after a consequential battle, and even in some cases with their hands mutilated so they can't continue to practice their craft. We know that scribes were also lent out from site to site and sometimes worked in a general region rather than at one site in particular. So it wouldn't be too outlandish to suggest that in this case, the victor might have captured the scribes of his captive in order to recreate some of the loser's greatest hits. Other theories exist, though. In 2014, Stephen Howson suggested that the intense antagonism between Copan and Quiriguá might have driven them perhaps to aesthetic competition, resulting in an oeuvre in which each attempted to better the other. Although he leaves space for the possibility that the same scribes might have worked at both sites, he seems to suggest that each site would have had their own designated scribes, rapidly developing new technologies and forms of representation, trying to outpace the other. Finally, Simon Martin recently noted that although evidence exists in the Maya world for scribes that were borrowed out or even captured in warfare, it's possible that in this specific case of Copan and Quiriguá, accomplished scribes, not necessarily from Copan, might have been attracted to Quiriguá's newfound independence and wealth after its rebellion and brought their services there. He expresses doubt in the likelihood that a master capable of creating full-figure glyphs was present at Quiriguá and simply awaiting the opportunity to show off his skills. And he instead suggests that there's a greater likelihood that an accomplished artist would have been attracted to Quiriguá after it grew because of its defeat of Copan. Each of these theories that I've presented here has merit in its own right and formed an important part of the foundation of my own study. However, these represent single sentences, at most a paragraph, in larger works that barely touch this event that shook the bedrock of the Eastern Maya world. By and large, no one has looked in detail at the immediate context of full-figure glyphs within this political context. Even Looper, who wrote an entire book, only mentions these full-figure glyphs in passing in his description of Kaktilu Chanyopat's monuments. So for the remainder of my presentation, I'll describe the advantages and disadvantages to each of these theories and present a few ideas of my own in an attempt to sift out a potential explanation for the emergence of full-figure glyphs at Quiriguá after the rebellion. So to create a clear understanding of the context in which full-figure inscriptions emerged, I began by creating a timeline of the events that occurred at both sites during this time period and the monuments with full-figure inscriptions that were dedicated. Previous scholars, including the ones I just mentioned, have done excellent work compiling the history of these two sites and their interactions and the order in which important monuments and buildings were dedicated, alongside a careful chronology of each site in particular. I've in turn compiled their data into the timeline here, placed within the context of full-figure monuments. And when we examine this timeline, an interesting gap emerges. You'll notice that these yellow triangles are full-figure inscriptions dedicated at Copan, and the gray ones are inscriptions dedicated at Quiriguá. 738 CE, we see a full-figure monument dedicated 2 years before at Copan, and then the fall of Copan at the hands of Quiriguá. And then we have a huge gap between that moment and the first dedication of a full-figure inscription at Quiriguá. So rather than immediately using full-figure glyphs as a way to demonstrate his newfound power and to taunt his defeated enemy, Kaktilu waited to commission the first full-figure monument until 766 CE, nearly 30 years after Copan's defeat. So if full-figure glyphs were truly taken as spoils of war, why wouldn't Kaktilu flaunt them immediately? After the decisive 738 defeat, Copan and Quiriguá underwent 4 different phases that I've highlighted here in 4 different colors, each aligning with a change in rulership at one of the sites and each showing a change in the relationship between the respective rulers. We begin with the decapitation of Washapahunu Kawil and the accession of Kakhoblach Chanyopat. And we notice at this point that he actually does not dedicate any monuments besides this one that makes a passing reference to Quiriguá as its subordinate, a slight subtle jab referencing the fact that Quiriguá was still in fact under Copan's control. Quiriguá doesn't really seem to pay much attention to this and continues building, and we see the reign of Nuckols-Wilde pass without incident. The following ruler, Nuckols-Wilde, actually commissions monuments that seem to more directly rebuff Quiriguá's independence at the hands of the ruler Nuckols-Wilde. He dedicates the hieroglyphic stairway that had been begun in the reign of Nuckols-Wilde. And in this monument, we actually see full figure glyphs showing up on the staircase and at the shrine at the top of the pyramid. So what's interesting here is that when full figure glyphs reemerge, they reemerge at Copan and not at Quiriguá. So this sort of weakens the theory, the idea that the scribes creating full figure glyphs might have been taken as a spoil of war. The rest of this time period sees the construction of huge monuments at Quiriguá, the tallest stele in the Maya world, but no full figure glyphs. This still has not happened yet. And so in the third stage, we see the accession of Yashpasach Chanyopat, excuse me, I wrote Kawil here, but it's Yopat, at Copan as Kaktilu Chanyopat continues to reign. So he's got a very long reign. He's still alive, still as ambitious and proud as ever. And during this time at Copan, Yashpasach Chanyopat is undergoing some social and political strife. So he's having to allow lower level elites to do things that previously they weren't allowed to do in order to garner their support. And that included allowing them to dedicate full figure monuments that we see here, these three that represent full figure benches. Now, these were dedicated not by rulers, but by lower level elites and presided over by Yashpasach Chanyopat. And so it's during this time period that we start to see the flourishing of full figure glyphs. This is also when we start to see them showing up at Quiriguá itself. So we see the dedication of Quiriguá's Stela D, that is the very first instance of full figure glyphs at Quiriguá. And I think it's very significant that it coincides with this third phase where tensions are starting to cool between Copan and Quiriguá. We're not seeing the intense antagonism that we saw with Nuckols-Wilde. We also see more full figure monuments dedicated at Quiriguá. It's as if at this moment in this third phase, once it's possible, Nuckols-Wilde does it over and over again. So we have Quiriguá zoomorph B as well, that has the longest inscription seen at Quiriguá of full figure glyphs. And then finally, Nuckols-Wilde passes into the underworld. Another ruler takes his place at Quiriguá, and we see relationships fully restored between the two sites. Jade Sky, the next Quiriguá ruler, actually carries out a ritual with Yashpasach. And so it gives a very clear idea that these sites are becoming friends again. We also see the dedication of one more monument with full figure glyphs, altar O is seen here, and the dedication of zoomorph P, which has been argued to be a full figure glyph in its own right. I'm happy to discuss that more in detail in the question and answer section. So looking at these proposed theories, the first we've already really discounted. The idea that scribes competed with Copan doesn't make sense if these full figure glyphs are happening at a time when the sites are starting to get along a little bit better. There was aesthetic competition for sure, but not during the time that full figure glyphs were being created at Quiriguá. So the two theories that I like are first that Quiriguá's growing power attracted accomplished scribes from elsewhere, or my own theory that after reconciliation, Copan allowed their scribes to work at Quiriguá and create full figure inscriptions. Now, I can't present anything for sure now, but I am currently beginning my field research to examine the style and authorship of these monuments to figure out if the scribes working at these sites were the same scribes or if they were different. And then I'll do a comparison to other glyphs on the western side of the Maya world as well. So just in sum, these full figure glyphs give us a really great opportunity to look inside the world of Maya rulers, the way that they communicated their power through the use and manipulation of visual images. And as we study these with more detail and looking closely at the interactions between these sites, we get an idea not only of the rulers that were in power, but the way that the scribes creating these worked, both within the political contexts and without them. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Catherine. That was absolutely fascinating, especially as someone with absolutely no information and prior knowledge about the region you work in. And judging by the chat, a lot of people found this really, really interesting. We have several questions and we do have time before we move on to our next session. So the first question is asking about the people depicted on these glyphs. Are they, do we know, true to life? Do people actually dress in that way? Or is this a special style kind of reserved for pictorial depictions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for the most part, it depends on the glyph. So these glyphs represent deities, and they also sometimes represent rulers and ancestors, excuse me, and the occasional animal, right? When it represents deities, we are seeing a true to life idea of how deities were represented in art. So they would usually wear a very simple loincloth. You can see one right here. And the loincloth itself, although simple, was usually dedicated with jade and other precious materials. And they would also wear headbands made out of materials as well, very precious materials. Here we have a representation of a ruler, and this was also true to life. The ruler would have worn these fantastic jade pectorals, earrings, and a headband representing his rulership. So yes, for the most part, these full figure glyphs are actually very true to life in the sense that they represent what is represented in figural art. And from what we know of everyday life of rulers, they would have been represented the same way as well.
Thank you very much. Someone asking, could it be that during the 30 years after the war, it's just that full-figured glyphs fell out of fashion, or maybe the glyph makers were engaged in other occupations?
That's a great question. And it's something that I'm really looking forward to digging into, because during these 30 years, we don't see full figure glyphs happening either at Copan or at Quiriguá. They happened once at Copan right before the big war, but then they fall into a hiatus. They do occur at Yaxchilan, which is a site on the western side of the Maya world during this period. So broadly, they still seem to be in fashion, but not at these two sites. And so it could be that maybe it was an ebb and flow of interest. It could also be that because of the materials and the words escaping me, but the things invested, the amount of effort invested into the war itself and recovery, they just couldn't afford the artist making these. So yeah, it's another really interesting aspect that I'm looking forward to digging into.
Thank you. Did the Maya build roads of any sort? The questioner can't recall ever seeing one. And did they have the wheel for use with carts?
Great questions. Roads, yes, we have huge roads that are actually becoming a lot more easy for us to identify with the advent of LiDAR. There's some really great documentaries about the use of LiDAR and the way that it's revealing roads and cities to us. So we know that they had a really intense networking system that connected all of the sites throughout the Maya world and throughout Mesoamerica in general. They had the concept of the wheel, but they did not use it for transportation. We've seen wheels only really for children's toys and for spindle whorls, but all of their transportation of goods was on the backs of human beings.
Thank you very much. One final question before we move on, asking if this kind of change in glyptic style could be to do with the legitimation, excuse me. Sorry, my 4-year-old decided that now was an excellent time to barge in. He had a whole half hour where I was muted, but no, now is necessary. Anyway, sorry, could this change have to do with the legitimization in Quiriguá or taking the artistic form from Copan?
Yes, and this was something that I was really hoping to be able to prove it right out the gate, was that full figure glyphs were a sort of legitimization. And they don't seem to be a form of legitimization at the very beginning, because I think portraiture does that. I think there's a really good argument that this portraiture is the beginning of legitimization. But I think that it's really significant that Washak Lahunu Kawil's last monument was a full figure monument. I think that Copan and Quiriguá both pick up on that during their period of competition, and that Quiriguá sort of subsumes that or tries to use that as part of legitimization. And so it's something that I would really love to be able to prove. I haven't been able to yet, but I think that there's a decent foundation building for it. It's a great question.
Thank you. And before we say goodbye and let you go, where can people find you online if they want to learn more about your work and what you do?
Absolutely, yeah. So Mesoamerican Studies Online, you can go to my website, and from there it'll link to both Twitter and Instagram. So Mesoamerican Studies Online is the website. I'm also personally on Twitter, C_Nuckols_Wilde, and that's linked also through my through the Twitter page for Mesoamerican Studies Online. So yeah, mostly the easiest way is through the website, and it'll link from there to everything else.
Wonderful.